I would like to bring in a good friend of the show, Laith Marouf. Laith is an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant. Laith, how you doing, my man? Welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Jamal. I'm doing okay, best I can be, under these conditions.
Yeah, I mean, look, man, my heart goes out to you. I was listening to a show that you did, and it made me realize that I don't think I ever had the opportunity to talk to you about what Syria was before all of this happened. And so it would help, I guess, to give the audience a little bit of context. Before the wars, before the regime change wars that the U.S. was engaged in, let's say going back to 2006, 2007 in the Bush administration, what was Syria like? Give us some context on what the country was before all of this took place.
Yeah, Syria was one of, I think, 2 countries only on the planet that had zero international debt. Syria was self-sufficient on all its energy needs, on all its food needs. It was the largest exporter of clothing in the region. It had medium and small electronic and machine industries, producing radios, TVs, all the household electronics, selling to the whole region. So it was the most industrialized in the region and the most self-sufficient. It had free healthcare, free education, and everything was pretty cheap. People would be able to eat whatever they want to, even if their incomes were low. So on average, the prices of things were 10% the price of things here in Lebanon. This was all before the war. And the country also had a reserve of 7 years of all of its essentials, oil, gas, all the grains and what have you. And that was all destroyed by the West and its Wahhabi death squads, and the country impoverished with the occupation of its oil and gas fields and its breadbasket in the northeast. Damascus is the oldest continuous capital in the world. It's also one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. It fell to the CIA, American colonialist plots, and here we are.
And Syria had been, let me ask you a different question on this also. From your take on this, there we are. Assad released his statement yesterday. What did you think of it? I mean, in the statement, he said he didn't leave right away. He stayed until Damascus fell. At that point, he realized that the jig was up, in which case he flew to Moscow. What did you think of the statement? I mean, the statement was longer than that, but I'm just giving a snapshot of the commentary in it. What did you think of it, though? What were your thoughts?
My thoughts is that this is not genuine. It's not written by the president of Syria. It's, I think, written by the Russian government as a way to absorb some of the blame that is coming to them right now. In my opinion, President Assad, as everybody knows, if they can look back on the news cycle a week and a half ago, he flew into Russia 4 days almost before the attacks on Aleppo by the Wahhabi death squads. It was announced by the official Russian media that he was there and that he was there with his family. And so, in my opinion, Russia had held him in Moscow at that point, and the country was made to surrender to Turkey and Israel, basically invasion from both sides, under the agreement of the Russians.
Now, what would that agreement have been, and why?
I think the agreement would be what Trump is already making deals with before his coming into office. The promise that Trump made is that he will end the war in Ukraine. Simultaneously, he wants to expand the wars in Western Asia against the axis of resistance. Therefore, I guess Russia made the deal that they can hold whatever territory they control right now in Ukraine in exchange for abandoning Syria and leaving the axis of resistance to fend for itself. And I think this is going to be, already is a strategic failure, mistake by the Russians. And they will regret the day that Damascus fell.
Now, why do you think that the Russians would even believe the U.S.? I mean, I could go through one agreement after the next where the U.S. lied. Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Istanbul agreements where they blew off, even the JCPOA. All of these were agreements that the U.S. effectively lied about. So why would, in this situation, where the Russians have a dominant military position, where the U.S. couldn't do anything about it one way or the other, where they make a deal with an untrustworthy actor?
Yeah, I don't think they believe the Americans, but at the same time, they know that the U.S. Getting involved in a war against the axis of resistance will entail the U.S. being busy for the next 10 years at least. And therefore, Russia sees that it's better that the U.S. is stuck again in the Middle East and Western Asia to give it time to build up itself even more so. You know, I know the Arabic people are the most maligned people right now on the planet, but if it wasn't for the Arabic people fighting and not surrendering to American interventions since the end of this collapse of the Soviet Union,
right.
The American military and would have surrounded already China and surrounded Russia a long time ago. The fact that the U.S. has been stuck for the better part of the last 30 years in wars genociding Arabic peoples, and the Arabic peoples not giving up and continuing to fight, is the reason that, number one, China was able to build up its economy to surpass the West, and for Russia to rebuild the state after the selling out of the state by Yeltsin.
Yeah.
So it is actually Arabic blood that assured China is what it is today. And it's Arabic blood that assured that Russia can defend itself today. And this is in the same concept. This is what Russia sees right now. They would rather the West get stuck again here and see themselves advance as fast as possible in the next 10 years before the West ends its wars here.
You know, I hadn't thought about it like that. I mean, I guess you do have a point in regards to the wars, given time for other matters. I mean, but truth be told, they're in a war now. And, you know, from the standpoint, I guess my thought is they're in a war now. And I can't believe, even based on what you just said there, where you're talking about, Syria being an ally, the states in the Middle East, especially in the context of the resistance, how that has been a benefit to Russia. I agree with you. It has been, which makes me difficult to believe that they would give it up willingly in this way. I find this to be a negative for Russia in this case. I would imagine that Russia also has to realize that giving up Syria in this case wouldn't necessarily be a positive, which makes me think that they wouldn't necessarily want to give it up. What do you say to people who point to items that, where they would say, well, Assad wasn't listening to warnings, that he was getting warnings by Iran and from Russia, and that in no situation was he responding to those warnings, that he seemed to be trying to get closer to Arab states and ignoring the things that the Russians, or for that matter, the Iranians are telling them What do you say to people who point that as being one of the major reasons for the fall?
That's a cop-out because obviously the Russians, number one, never allowed Syria to fight back against the Zionist colony, for instance. It took the money of Syria to deliver the S-300 air defenses, but then never allowed the Syrian military to use them, and sat and watched as the Israelis bombarded Syria on a weekly basis for 10 years. In fact, I would say that the only time the Syrian government was able to shoot down an F-15 was through the use of a modified S-200 that was modified by the Syrian scientists at the Military Industrial Research Center. And within weeks, I think the Russians must have given the Israelis the whereabouts of the scientist who was immediately assassinated. This was in 2016. So truthfully, if Russia wanted Syria to win completely this war against the Wahhabi death squads and the American plots, they could have. Similarly, in 2016, the Syrian military, Hezbollah, and their allies were crushing the Wahhabi death squads in Idlib, and that required even the Turkish military to intervene directly. And there was the Battle of Saraqib on the intersection of the M5 and the M4 highways. Right. And Hezbollah defeated, along with the Syrian military, defeated the Turkish military. And that is when Russia intervened to stop the advancement of the Syrian military and its allies. So what we saw is, the Russians kind of are the ones to blame for where we are today. If they let the Syrian military continue its work, at that time, there wouldn't have been any more a presence of the Wahhabi death squads in the country. I don't know if my camera is frozen here for a second. I don't know why.
Oh, it'll come back. Sometimes it freezes. It is frozen, but it'll be back. Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll come back because I can hear you perfectly fine, and I think the audience can hear you fine. Why, if they were willing to expend that much energy? Oh, can you hear me, Laith?
Yeah, I can hear you.
If they were willing to expend that much energy into it, like, why do you think they would make the decision to all of a sudden change course? Because if you remember, even in the way that you were recounting it, they had gotten to the point where they helped preserve the state, the Syrian state, because the Syrian state was on the brink of collapse. What made them change their mind, if that was the case? You think it all boiled down to the deal in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Russians did the same mistake that the Soviet Union did in its relationships with the Arabic peoples. Okay, the Soviet Union, although it had this battle with the West, like the West, it feared a united Arabic people. Okay, so the Soviet Union did work against Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and the unification of Syria and Egypt. And the reason that this is because in the minds of geographically peripheral powers like the United States, Russia, China, if the heart of the geography where the Arabic people are is unified, then that central power becomes the most powerful, because the peripheries will have to go through the territories of the Arabic peoples to do trade and whatever. This goes back all the way, of course, to something like Columbus and the Europeans wanting to go around the Arabs to reach India, and where they eventually the quote-unquote discovery of the Americas was. So this is still the same logic. If the Arabic people are unified, they become sovereigns and could outpace everybody else because it's a huge territory. It has all the resources needed. It has a huge population and is central where all trade and communication has to pass through this geography. So this, I think, always pollutes decisions even in places like Russia or even China. Okay, and remember, it wasn't the Syria that was pushing to try to sway the Gulf countries or Turkey away from American hegemony. It was Russia, China, and even Iran that were doing that, whether by courting the Saudis and the Turks to enter the BRICS, and or to, as we saw, China broker a detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Those were all work of the Chinese and the Russians. It wasn't the work of. So Syria also at that point in 2016 already was practically lost all its sovereignty. There was not only American troops on the ground and Turkish troops and Israelis occupying, but also Russians and Iranians on the ground and so on. So in reality, the president of Syria couldn't make decisions without his allies at least agreeing to them. And therefore, the Syrian military, the sovereign decisions of the Syrian military fell into the hands of the Russians. And so once we know that, once we understand all of this, and we see how once you extract President Assad from Syria, as the Russians did, the Syrian military command was being told basically to give up. In fact, I would say everybody remembers in the first 2-3 days of the beginning of the invasion of Syria over last week, we heard multiple times that all the Russian communication equipment that the Syrian military was using was being jammed. And that's something that the Russians never had to deal with before, which means that somebody knew how to jam this equipment. And so the units on the front lines were not getting any commands. And eventually there was, quote unquote, infiltration of those communication devices, and orders to retreat and surrender were given on air. So that cannot happen if the Russians didn't want that to happen. And clearly it did happen. So I would say the Russians sold Syria in the hopes that they can, entangle the West in more wars in the region and chaos in the region, while they can build up their power in preparations for any direct war. But by that time, look, this is where the stupidity of the strategy of both China and Russia has been. If there is no axis of resistance, it's the only third pole in the world that could have been challenging to American hegemony was the axis of resistance, other than China and Russia. Everybody else is small chips. Everybody else is if they're alone, they'll be taken over very easily if the United States wants to. For instance, Venezuela, so far away from the rest of the power structures in the world, it could be just isolated and taken over. There's nothing to stop the US at that point from. And remember, it was Iran, for instance, that broke the siege on Venezuela. It wasn't the Russians, right? So once the axis of resistance is gone, and for instance, all the waterways in the world are back under control of the US, let's presume the defeat of Yemen, okay, then all the US has to do is close the trade routes on China, and Chinese economy collapses, and China's back to poverty like the 1940s, okay? And similarly with Russia, you don't have to go directly to war with Russia. Once the economy of China collapses and doesn't need to buy Russian oil and gas, and the Russian oil and gas has been replaced by Qatari and Saudi oil and gas that is piped through Syria to Europe, what will happen to Russia's economy? Okay.
Laith, this is deeply cynical. I, I I agree with your analysis, which is the reason what makes me difficult to agree with your analysis, if that makes sense. Because I agree with you. Like I have a hard time believing that they wanted to lose Syria in this way. And I know Syria is not anybody's to have. I just mean it in the sense of, um, especially the blood and treasure that it gave in order to defend Syria. It feels very weird for me to all of a sudden on a dime turn and let it sink or let it fall to, the Israelis, the Turks, the Americans, etc., with the potential of losing their own bases, or for that matter, to have jihadists go to areas that are Russian dominated. Like, that is a difficult thing for me to kind of get my head around, especially considering they're winning the war in Ukraine, and there's nothing that the United States, or for that matter, Europe, can do about it, short of going to nuclear war. Like, what do you say to the people with that point of view? Because I know I'm not going to be the only one with that framing and that point of view of, well, they're already winning the war in Ukraine. Why, look, I would understand it in the sense of this is a bloody war. They don't necessarily want to expend a lot of resources into another bloody war in Syria, especially if they didn't necessarily believe that the Syrian army was up to it. Like, I can get it in that sense, but it's hard for me to go with the notion that, well, we want to make a deal with Trump, and so we're going to sacrifice Syria to make this deal with Trump, when you can't necessarily trust the U.S. one way or the other. Go for it. No, please.
Okay, so look at it this way. Syria, as I said to you, was self-sufficient on energy needs before the war. So once the Americans stole the Syrian oil and gas, and Syria had no resources to run electricity or anything, the Iranians and the Russians, who are the largest oil and gas exporters in the world, could have flooded the Syrian market with those needs. Russia could have flooded the Syrian market with wheat to replace the wheat that the U.S. is looting, and that would have fortified the population and stopped the impoverishment that was happening. At one point, the Syrian soldiers, their salary was $20 a month. Okay, so these are not stupid mistakes. Okay, these are decisions made to make sure that the Syrian government and the Syrian military have to listen to Russia. And Russia's interest, specifically with Turkey, is tied to the Bosphorus Strait in Istanbul. If the Turks close that strait, Russia is locked in, and their navy can only be active in the Arctic, and it will lose any projection of power into the rest of Asia, South Europe and the Mediterranean in general, okay? And the ability to even reach something like Latin America. So this priority that the Russians had meant that they did not want to break the neck of Erdogan in Syria. Okay, so they don't have to deal with a closure of the Bosphorus and or having to go to war against Turkey, which is a population of 100 million. Okay, so yes, it's smaller than Russia and whatever, but it is like not a small country, right? So those priorities showed anybody that says the Syrian military didn't want to fight is being racist, personally, I think. Okay, the Syrian military wanted to fight, didn't have the money to do so, and had no air cover once the Russians stopped giving them air cover, and there was waves after waves of drones attacking the Syrian positions coming from Ukrainian Turkish drones and Ukrainian special forces that were side by side with these Wahhabi death squads that invaded. Okay, so No, Russia made this deal. They made their bed and they're going to sleep in it. Okay. And they're going to have to regret what they did, I personally think. And one last thing I would say here is that remember this meme that was running around over the last few years because Russia is doing so great and so on, and the Chinese are doing great compared to the US. This is the meme was Iran and Russia play chess, China plays Go, USA plays tic-tac-toe. And it was supposed to be, you know, making fun of American strategic planning. In reality, the Russians and the Iranians were playing chess, the Chinese were playing Go, and the US was playing chicken. And it just drove over the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and the table and crushed them all, while the Russians and the Iranians are planning 12 steps ahead. What we saw is the total bombardment of Lebanon, full genocide in Gaza, total destruction of Syria, while they're still calculating, the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese. In this reality, all this in you know, thinking and overthinking of things is actually a weakness.
What is HTS?
Yeah, HTS is the rebranding of Al-Qaeda in Syria, which was a rebranding of ISIS, which was a rebranding of the Islamic State in Iraq. And Al-Jolani, or whatever his real name is, Al-Jolani is a kind of a, you know, cover name that they use for him, or an operational name. And specifically, they picked the word Jolani because it means the one from the Golan Heights, just to make him look like he is a nationalist, you know, Syrian, right? Yeah. But in reality, he's a Saudi citizen. He's not even Syrian, okay? And he used to be the second, you know, right-hand man, the second in command of the Islamic State in Iraq with Zarqawi, the Jordanian, and was jailed in Abu Ghraib, and eventually somehow released, and ended up being the second in command of what became ISIS with al-Baghdadi, and then eventually flipped one more time and created Al-Qaeda in Syria, and then one more time changed the name into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which means the Committee for the Liberation of Bilad al-Sham, the Greater Syria region, the Levant region. And now they've changed his name again. They're calling him Ahmad al-Shara. And again, this is, you know, number one, so they can rid him of the you know, responsibility to liberate the Golan. They dropped the Golani name,
right?
Okay, but then they adopted this. You see, while the Israelis are occupying more of the Golan, and they adopted al-Shara name for him because this is one of the most honorable families in South Syria, the Shara family, and the former vice president of Syria, Farouk al-Shara, was, you know, in the beginning of the Troubles in 2012, resigned and stayed in Syria, refused to criticize the government, but refused to support the terrorists. And he's, you know, he's considered as the most beloved politician in the Arabic world over the last, you know, century almost, okay? Because he's a man that never stole any money, never did any business. He stayed in his lane of foreign affairs, and eventually a vice president of Syria, and everybody loves him. And in fact, the Saudis and Qataris, because he's so beloved, during the beginning of the war on Syria, they kept on saying Farouk al-Shara should be the new president of Syria and Assad should step down. Not because they wanted Farouk al-Shara to be, but to burn his card, to make sure that you know, he can't actually be the president of Syria. And that's why he stepped. And now today, the same Qataris and Saudis that abused the name of Farouk al-Shara at the beginning of the Troubles have now looted the name al-Shara and put it on this Saudi militia guy.
Wow. Does HTS control the state of Syria at this point?
Yeah, I mean, they clearly do. But if In reality, most probably the Israelis and the Americans are the ones that are controlling anything. We just heard today that he's going to be disbanding these militias and merging them into the Syrian army.
Well, that's what they say. Well, the reason why I say that is these are different groups. And from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, HTS is kind of a small group in association with several groups. Like you have the Uyghurs, you have some of these groups coming from other parts of the Middle East that have just kind of converged. Are they going to be willing to do that? Meaning, are they really going to be willing to give up their weapons, give up their affiliation with whatever small individual group that they're basically functioning in, and go into the Syrian military? I mean, many of these people aren't Syrian, or correct me if I'm wrong, though.
Yeah, so right now, as we see, there is an ethnic cleansing campaign happening in the south of Syria,
right,
where the Israelis are occupying. So more than 100,000 right now Syrians have been expelled from the areas that the Israelis occupied over the last week. And they're occupying now a territory that's larger than the occupied Golan Heights. Simultaneously, there is ethnic cleansing campaigns happening across the country. Already something like 150,000 Shia from the Aleppo and Homs region have crossed into Lebanon. There is a huge number of Christians that are leaving. Yeah. And of course, the Alawis in the coastline. So this is all happening while at the same time there is, killing campaigns happening on the ground that we don't hear about because there's no independent media on the ground. There's only pro-imperialist media in the country. So what we see is a mass demographic change campaign being conducted as we speak. And the first thing that the Israelis did on the first day of bombardment of Syria was destroy the Foreign Affairs Ministry, the Immigrations Ministry, the public, the National Record Registry, for citizenship and so forth. So right now we don't know who is Syrian, who isn't Syrian, because all the records have been destroyed by the Israelis on purpose. So what we will see is that many of these foreign Wahhabi death squads being given citizenship. And all these other Syrians that are escaping and or whatever are outside the country will lose their citizenship, will cease to be Syrian. So this is happening as we speak, and nobody's talking about it, obviously. The other thing that I would say about these Uyghurs and the Turkic peoples from Central Asia, this is why it's really stupendous what the Russians and Chinese did or didn't do in Syria. Erdogan was promised by the Americans not only to revive his Ottoman, dreams, but also to revive the Mongol horde. Okay, the Mongol invasion from Central Asia was basically a Mongol Turkic, their invasion, and right now the Americans have promised Erdogan that he can do a reverse Mongol Turkic invasion towards Central Asia, all the way to Xinjiang or for the Uyghurs. Okay, so he's being told that he can be the new Ottoman Khalif ruling over the Arabs, but also he can be the new Mongol Khan that can rule over the Turkic and Mongolic peoples. And so these hordes of Wahhabi death squads that are from Central Asia that have been trained for the last 15 years on the killing fields of Syria, are going to be redirected to create problems in all of the Central Asian countries, and most probably, if things get out of hand, cut off the border between China and Russia, if not even create a terrorist campaign inside what Erdogan and his fellows would call Eastern Turkmenistan, inside China.
I'm curious on something else. Blinken, so in some of the reports, there was a report specifically by a Christian fighter. I think they call him a senior commander in Syrian army. And he talked about how there were several things that were taking place all at once, and it was kind of a fair bit of chaos associated with it. But he noted that the Kurds were fighting both, that the Kurds were fighting the Assad government, and at other times fighting with some of the other groups that were backed by HTS, or that were working with HTS. And at this point, at the end of all of this, when the government had fell or had fallen, you get the Kurds begging the Israelis for help because the jihadists that the Turks are backing are effectively destroying the Kurds. I mean, they're effectively going to move and take over the entirety of Syria, correct? Or do you disagree with that? I mean, because I don't know the incentive for Turkey, who considers the Kurds to be a terrorist organization, to pull back their, as you said, their hordes in order to get rid of that Turkish population. I'm sorry, the Kurdish population, especially considering they're on the most valuable land in Syria. Or do you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, no, I think the Kurdish people will pay the price of their elite, once again, working with imperialist foreign powers to steal their neighbors' lands. Mm-hmm. This has been the problem with the Kurdish people, the curse that has been on them for the last 150 years, is they constantly worked with imperialist powers, not to liberate themselves in the Kurdistan mountain range in Turkey, but to loot the lands of Arabic and Assyrian peoples, meaning Christian Syrians, that they see as weaker than them.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, today, nobody in Syria is going to shed a tear for the Kurds because they, ruled ruthlessly and stole the resources and lands of the Arab and Assyrian peoples in northeast Syria. And I think the United States will abandon them just like they abandoned them in World War I, and they've abandoned them when Saddam Hussein was in the pocket of the Americans, and they will abandon them again because their elite have made them into tools of foreign powers. You shouldn't be surprised when they throw you in the garbage bin after, like a used condom. So this is what's going to happen, and Turkey is already pushing through northeast Syria. They took Manbij, and they're going to take now Ain al-Arab, or what it is called by the Kurdish militias, Kobani.
They've been taking quite much territory, yeah.
Yes, and there's nothing to stop them. Why would the U.S. stop them? Why would Israel stop them? I mean, this is the stupidity, of course, of the Kurdish elite. The Kurdish elite also, again, collaborated with the Israelis since the 1940s, both in Iraq and Syria and Turkey, to try to undermine their brothers and sisters, to create a apartheid state on the image of Israel. That's what they were going to do in Syria with this quote-unquote Rojava, this imaginary Rojava. They were going to rule as a minority over the Arabic population. And they were doing like, what's his name? Zelensky, basically. They wanted the new Israel. And well, in the situation, Israel equals ethnic cleansing and genocide, and that's what's going to happen to them.
Yeah, they're going to get it. By the way, what happens to the region in regards to Lebanon, for example? I mean, are these areas under threat? And before I even get to Lebanon, can Israel really be comfortable with a consolidated terrorist state that is now on their border? I mean, not to mention, they've been bombing it nonstop ever since the government has fallen. That can't necessarily be something that the population is okay with. Is that going to bite them in the ass at some point? And for that matter, what does it mean for Lebanon or for Iraq or for even Turkey at this point? It just seems very, look, it is hard for me to wrap my head around. I know that the U.S. uses terrorist organizations to accomplish their objectives. I mean, they did the same thing in Ukraine. They did it, well, they would like to use Taiwan for similar function. I guess my thing is, in this very particular case, though, the terrorist group took over and cannibalized the government and expelled other groups out the government. And so you effectively have this rogue government that is now on the border of these countries and are close to these countries, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Iraq, or for that matter, whether it's Israel. Is Israel going to pay for this later on when this government turns? I can't believe for the moment that the population of this country is okay with Israel and what it's doing.
Look, the population is obviously against what's happening, but it's going to take the population some time to get off the floor, basically, after taking such a beating. These Wahhabi death squads, it's basically the Saudi government and the Emirati government. And the Saudi and Emirati government are in best buddies of the Israelis. I mean, all you need to do with these Wahhabi Contras is send them a few prostitutes, maybe a few underage boys, and a few bottles of alcohol, and you're good. This has been basically how the Sauds have been, pacified over the last 100 years by the Americans and the Brits. So no, I don't think that the Israelis fear anything of these Wahhabi death squads in Syria. They are their slaves, their house slaves, and they're easy to manipulate. And most of the leadership of HTS and these other groups are actually Mossad agents. There's no doubt in my mind that Israel is 100% safe. They will obviously use the excuse of this, Wahhabi government to continue bombing Syria. But as we see, they will not be opposed by these Wahhabi squads. I mean, like if these, Al-Julani and others are actually sovereign, they would have defended the military equipment of Syria that fell under their control. On the contrary, what they've been doing is going to, videoing themselves with the Al Jazeera, entering the bunkers of the Syrian military in the mountain ranges and showing their location. And hours later, the Israelis would be bombing them. So they are actually working with the Israelis to destroy the defense capabilities of Syria.
Look, I think I agree with you on this one. I mean, it seems super weird to me that Israel had been murdering indiscriminately Palestinians and Lebanese for a year. And these guys were training, getting equipment, getting, all of this capability. And what they do is attack the Syrian government. And they don't do anything to Israel, who's murdering other Muslims, which you would think that because they call themselves the Army of Islam, that they would care about. So I totally agree with you on this. They seem to have some sort of relationship that was worked out in advance.
The one last thing I would say,
please.
Yeah. Look, the HTS ordered all the Palestinian groups in Syria to disarm, to disband all their training camps, and they eventually went and attacked the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, the leftist, progressive, communist resistance group, Palestinian group. On the borders of Lebanon. There was a huge battle yesterday, and they were trying to slaughter them. And the Lebanese military, which is also captured by the West, blocked the exit of the PFLP fighters into Lebanon. So they surrounded them, basically. So this is one thing. The other thing is that Al-Julani yesterday or this morning in a statement said that he will not allow Syrian territory to be used to attack Israel. And while Israel is occupying his land, while Israel is bombarding him, he's saying we will not, even as us as Syrians, we will not be attacking the Zionist colony. And the last thing is, we got to see from here is that They're saying, oh, we're tired, we can't fight Israel right now, but we're ready to liberate the Uyghurs. So it's clear where they're going to be directed.
Yeah.
Okay. And these are Zionist tools, and unfortunately, Russia and China made big mistakes.
Wow. Wow. This is, man, like I said, my heart goes out to all of these people in this situation, and my heart goes out to you. Again, it's one thing for me to observe it. I'm observing it from a distance. And where, even though I feel some kind of way about it, I feel some kind of way about it in the sense that my government is driving this nonsense, the people and what these people are going to go through as a direct result. By the way, do you think that this is going to collapse? Meaning, do you think this is going to collapse under its own weight in the way that Libya collapsed or the way that Iraq collapsed? Or do you think they're going to be able to hold this together in some way?
Well, I mean, in Libya, the plan was what we see today for the West, because they are extracting the Libyan oil and gas nonstop at zero cost, basically. And all the Libyan money from those sales are in American and Western banks. And so it's in their interest of the West to continue the chaos in Libya while looting all the resources. And so even if we see chaos descending in Syria, that's probably part of the plan. As we see now, it's been 10 somewhat years that the Americans are looting the gas and oil and wheat of Syria openly, as Trump said it. So they may want to continue to loot it. In fact, I would venture to say that the Arabic oil and gas fields are what kept America rich over the last 100 years, because these house slaves in the Gulf really don't get more than 10% of the revenues of this oil. The rest is all in the pockets of the United States and the West, and in the banks in the West. If I was in charge of the axis of resistance right now, I'd burn all the oil fields in the Arabic world immediately and let the American economy collapse. This oil and gas didn't bring anything to the Arabic people except the curse of imperialism.
That is what Iran is threatening. In fact, we're saying if you attack us, the oil fields are going up in smoke. Well, one last question. I got to be honest. I was chomping at the bit to talk to you today, because I definitely wanted to get through a lot of these topics, and I wanted your take on it. Why do you think Iran has been so reticent to respond to Israel? I mean, because if you think about it, the axis of resistance was effectively being attacked, with Iran issuing threats, but not necessarily getting involved, despite the fact that Israel seemed very clear that they were bloodthirsty and that nothing was going to prevent them from continuing their campaign. Why? I mean, they've been threatening True Promise 3 for the last, 3 months, give or take. Why do you think that they were less ready or interested in getting involved, especially now since they're on the chopping block? They're next.
Yeah, I think Iran has a huge problem in terms of how slow it takes decisions. It's a big country, 90 somewhat million, almost 100 million. Yeah. There's many factions internally, although it looks like it's a unified country. There's a lot of factions and a lot of interests that need to be brought into decisions so the country can stay kind of solidified.
Yeah.
And so obviously the West and the Israelis took advantage of how slow decisions are made in Iran. The other thing is that I don't think anyone in the axis of resistance leadership, in Iran specifically, understood that the Western populace are neutered, are eunuchs that will not do anything. I mean, you could understand that in the first 6 months of the genocide in Gaza, the axis of resistance wanted the world to see the genocide being committed. So in order to win the will of and opinions in the world, which they did, But once after 6 months, it was clear that, for anyone that has any brain cells, that the Western populace, okay, will go out and demonstrate, but they will not stop the genocide being committed in their name.
Yeah.
They will not take any risk. There's not even something like that was like in the 1960s or 70s, like the Black Panthers or the American Indian movement or the Red Army in Italy or Germany or whatever that took arms against the state in the West and aided the Palestinians and others, as happened before. There's none of that. So their inability to understand that there's no such thing as democracy. This idea that you can, Trump or Biden or Labor or conservatives in the UK, this is all propaganda. There's no such thing as democracy. They played this game thinking that it's true. So this is another failure. This is another strategic failure in planning. So 6 months passed and they didn't go on the offensive, and they lost the momentum by that point. And we see what happened. They should have went into a direct attacks, overwhelming destruction of Israeli Air Force and air bases at the 6 months marker of the genocide, and they didn't. And now they're paying for it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Because the reality of it is they're in the same situation now without any support or resistance to back them up in this. I mean, at this point, Gaza's isolated. Yeah, Laith, man, thank you for this. Laith Marouf, he's an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant. You can follow Laith. By the way, Laith, where can people find you?
You can find us on freepalestine.video, our website, just to make sure that you put www. We're having a problem there with the video, with the website. And you can find all the links to our socials there. We are producing, upwards of 10 reports from the field in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and Jordan now. We need your donations. We had an office in Damascus with 4 youth that were producing some of the content that got attacked and looted. We lost all the equipment there last week, and we're having to obviously find ways to extract our workers from Syria so they don't get hung or lynched in the streets. So please donate generously for Christmas. freepalestine.video is the website. Just put the www.
Laith, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Jamal.